Доброго дня. Від імені Центру
Good
Нова Європа
morning.
вітаємо вас
On behalf of
на
New
цій
Europe
сьогоднішній
Center, we would like to welcome you at our today's presentation
аналітичної записки.
of the
Тому я дуже
analytic
рада сьогодні вітати наших
paper, discussion
спікерів.
paper. I'm welcoming
Дуже
our
раді вас
guests and
повідати
speakers
всіх, хто
today.
нас
I'm
дивиться
happy to
онлайні.
welcome
Можна
everybody who
дивитися
joined
українською,
us
англійською
online.
мовою.
You can
Українська
watch us both
трансляція
in
відбувається
Ukrainian
в
and in
Facebook, а
English.
англійська на YouTube.
Ukrainian broadcasting is in Facebook and
Власне,
English in YouTube.
для початку я б хотіла зауважити кілька
To
слів
begin with, I'd like
щодо
to say a
власне
few
аналізу,
words
який ми збираємося сьогодні
about the
презентувати.
discussion paper that we are going to
Цей
present today.
аналіз він є своєрідним аналітичним
The paper
внеском в
is a special
підготовку
analytic
України до
contribution
процесу
in
вступних
preparation of
переговорів з
Ukraine
Європейським
to
Союзом.
accession
Тому
talks
що,
with the
незважаючи
EU.
на те, що Україна отримала
Regardless the fact
статус
that
кандидата
Ukraine
в ЄС лише в
was
червні
granted
цього року, і
EU
ми тому
candidate
отримали
status
достатньо
in
небагато часу,
June this
але
year,
можна
little
впевнено
time
сказати, що
passed,
Україна вже
but
готується
we
до
can
відкриття
be
вступних
assertive
переговорів.
that Ukraine has
Рахується
already
вона
prepared the
власне в
process of accession talks. There are two
перший
ways
спосіб це те,
it
що
is
вона виконує
preparing
7
for the talks.
рекомендацій
First of all, it's
Європейського
following
Союзу,
7 recommendations
які
that
вона
were put
отримала разом з
forward by the EU
кандидатством
that it
для виконання
received together
обов'язків,
with
які
the candidate
виникнуть
status.
в
The way they are being
відповідних
implemented
звітах,
could be
також в
followed in
кандидатських
relevant reports
незалежних
of the
звітах, які
government and
здійснюються
candidate
за
check,
ініціативи
of the
Центру Нова Європа.
independent monitoring that is done by
І
the
важливо те,
New
що ми
Europe
сприймаємо,
Center.
можливо, в деяких
And
країнах
it's
є
important that
ці 7 рекомендацій сприймають як
those 7
позаумови до
recommendations
кандидатства. Ми їх
are
сприймаємо
considered
як передумови
kind
до
of
членства.
post conditions
Бо
for
для
the
вступних переговорів, для
candidacy.
відкриття
We
вступних
see it
переговорів,
as preconditions
тому
for
вона є
the
надзвичайно
opening
важливою.
talks. Therefore,
Інший
they are
спосіб, в
of
який
paramount
готується
importance. Another way we are
готуються вступні
preparing
переговори,
for the opening
це
talks.
вивчення досвіду інших
This
країн,
is learning
які
experience
вже
of
були
other
членами
countries
Європейського
that
Союзу,
are
які
either
вступали в
EU
ЄС
members already, that
відносно
joined
недавно,
EU relatively
або ті,
recently,
які є
or
кандидатами на
the countries
членство
that are
і вже
candidates for
перебувають
the
в
EU
процесі
accession
переговорів
and are in
з
a
ЄС.
negotiation
І
process,
от,
in talks
власне,
process
тому
with the
Центр
EU.
Нова Європа зрозумів,
New
що ми
Europe
можемо
Center
зробити також свій аналітичний внесок
understood that we
щодо
can
вивчення
also make
досвіду
our
інших країн,
analytic contribution by learning experience of
саме
other countries
для того, щоб Україна його могла вже
so that
врахувати у
Ukraine
досвід
can take this
чинного
experience into
засвоєний
account,
тими країнами,
consider the lessons
також
that have been
виявити
learned by
певні,
the
скажімо так,
countries,
дипломатичні чи політичні трюки. І
learn diplomatic
саме
or
тому ми
political tricks.
зробили 37
Therefore,
інтерв'ю і зустрічей
we
в
conducted
певних столицях
37
Центральної
interviews and
Європи,
meetings in
зокрема
the
в
countries of
Варшаві,
Central
в
Europe, in
Празі,
particular Warsaw,
в
Prague,
країнах Балтії, в Латвії, в Ризі, а
the
також
Baltic
зробили
countries, Latvia and
візит в країни
Riga,
Західних Балкан, це були
and
3 країни
also
Західного
Western
Балкану,
Balkans, 3 countries,
Хорватія,
in particular Croatia,
Македонія, Чорногорія.
Northern Macedonia, and
І
Montenegro.
саме на основі цих зустрічей,
Based
інтерв'ю,
on the interviews
які
and
ми мали, ми
meetings
підготували
that
рапорт
were
разом з
held
Леонідом Літрою,
together with
є
Leonid Litra,
рекомендації для уряду
we
України, і
prepared
аналіз
analysis
також
and recommendations for the
готується щодо
government
цих
of
переговорів
Ukraine.
з ЄС
Our
також
discussion
з
paper is
досвіду
called
України і
Preparing
з
for
досвіду
Accession
інших
Talks with
країн.
the EU Tips and
Звичайно,
Tricks
це
for
все
Ukraine
видається
from
уважним,
experience of other
тому що ми
countries.
розуміємо, що кожен
It's
процес
worthwhile
переговорів з
saying
кожною
that
країною це
every
є
accession
абсолютно
talks
таким
for every country
індивідуальним
is a
кейсом,
tailored process, it's
унікальним
individual
кейсом.
case, it's
Його
unique
не
case.
можна порівнювати з іншими. Плюс
It
ми
can't be
чудово розуміємо,
compared
що процес
to
вступу до
other
2008
cases.
року
We understand that
вони були
accession
іншими,
conditions
ніж
prior to
вони є
2008 were
після того.
different than
Можливо, в
they
останнє
are
були і країни-члени
after
ЄС, і
2008 and
країни-кандидати,
now,
чи
and
країни, які вступали в ЄС
both EU
раніше
countries and
з
candidates
новою
to EU
процедурою щодо
accession were
розширення чи
happy
затвердження
about the
процедури так
enlargement of
зване велике
EU
розширення,
uh, back in
підтвердження
2004
процедури.
when there was this Big
Після
Bang
того, значить,
enlargement.
ентузіазм була більша
Enthusiasm and
запалення
joy
в
subsided a little bit and was confined only to accession countries, to countries that were acceding. Of course, we would like to return this enthusiasm and these dynamics, but we will see. Another major difference is that new methodology has been put in place in 2020, recently enough. This methodology has complicated the process. Maybe, maybe not. We will be discussing it today during our presentation with our highly esteemed guest from Montenegro, Milena. What do we have in common with the countries that joined EU in the past decade and those who are in the process of negotiation, and with the current candidates such as Ukraine and Moldova? Of course, accession talks will comprise both political and technical components, and this political component will probably be more important than technical component, regardless the fact that technically speaking, we will have to achieve a lot. When we were preparing this discussion paper, we raised a lot of questions to our guests, whether accession talks are really talks or this is the implementation of European acquis into the legislation of a country. And the conclusion was made that in order to succeed in EU talks, we need four components: consensus, both political and societal, people, institutions, and advocation. I'd like to give the floor over to the co-author of this discussion paper, Leonid Litra, who will present our findings regarding the components. And my first question for you is the following. Is talks or negotiations really negotiations? Or maybe Ukraine is going to be a unique case in this regard, and talks will remain talks, or that'll be more of a standard process?
Great to be part of this research indeed. As you already mentioned, we did a lot of interviews, and of course it's this discussion paper we prepared, it's an attempt to summarize all these efforts, but of course this is not, and it does not include everything we've heard and everything we've learned from the interviews we had in the 6 countries you mentioned. But I think one question is that we ask quite often, as you rightly pointed out, is that is it really about negotiations? I mean, when you starting negotiations with the EU, like, are you in the position to negotiate? My impression is that, like, looking into the experience of these countries and hearing what we were told by people who are involved directly in the negotiations, is that you basically can negotiate a very few things with the EU, but to the great extent you have to, I mean, the candidate country has to adopt the acquis, to transpose the legislation, and to make progress in the reforms which are covered by the accession process, and pretty much everything is covered by the accession process. And the logic of this is as simple as that the candidate country wants to integrate in the EU and not the vice versa. So this is the way it works. Therefore, this is something we discussed, and I think we came to the conclusion, to preliminary conclusion, that we can negotiate the transition terms. I mean, when you adopt the acquis, as it was in the case of the association agreement we have with the European Union, we can give some times to certain industries, to certain to certain economy ramifications, basically, to prepare for to prepare to face a free market competition and so on and so on. But also, I think I would like to mention that during the negotiations process, the country can have some smaller, let's say, smaller. Some cases when they can defend the rights of certain traditional producers or something that is really specific for the country. And we see that some countries manage to do this, others don't. So that is why it's really important to prepare this process in a proper manner, because I would like to mention maybe from the beginning that one important thing was that, like in Ireland from the Western Balkans, is that the countries received the membership basically perspective, the recognition of the European aspiration back in 2002, and they all started in a way from the same point. But then we have today so different results, and this also shows that it's very important to have the capacity and all the stars should align, because one thing Alona mentioned about the fee for important areas we found in our discussion paper is people, political consensus, institutions, and advocacy. But I would like also to add here a special element, as we call it, which is the bilateralization of the relations, when one country can basically block the entire process. And this happened with, for instance, with Bulgaria and with North Macedonia. So I think Ukraine has also to pay attention to this, because we have these issues with certain EU member states, where today, for instance, we have Hungary, which is blocking the allocation of the 18 billion euro package for Ukraine, for their own reasons. They say it's not about Ukraine, but still, I mean, Ukraine is a collateral victim in this respect. So maybe since we don't, I have to limit myself, since I want to that we have a discussion on this. I will just go through very quickly through the people, political consensus, institutions, and advocacy. I think that one thing we heard again about people is quite important, that the people who are involved in the negotiations process should be pretty much the same people. I mean, there should be an effort to keep these people on board for the entire process, because they carry the experience they have. And for instance, we were told that in North Macedonia, about, I mean, 90% of the people who were involved at some point, not in the negotiations, but in preparing, because they're only starting, but some 90%, basically, almost pretty much everyone left the team, which is, of course, a very big loss, I would say, for the potential of the team, of the negotiation team on the country to negotiate. So one thing we should already think in Ukraine, this is the retention policy of the talented people, but also invest in new people. Just to give an example, in Croatia, we had we heard that the average age of the people involved in negotiations was 27 when they started, 27 years. And then as they went through the process, these people gained more experience, but they stayed to a great extent with the team. And that was very helpful, because these people are usually very agile, they are more prepared, and they one thing we were told also about the people, which is quite uncommon, I mean, that they shall learn the Brussels language. And this, I think, is something is also important, because in our part of the world, I think we have sometimes a different, I would say, approach or a different way in approaching certain things or certain reforms. And here I go straight to the advocacy part, because I mean, if you don't do advocacy, and the member states don't know, then you can say that it didn't happen. I mean, in a way, because Brussels is of course our friend in the process, and they do know about what happens, what kind of reforms, but the capitals, the EU member states, and especially the EU member states which are, to put it mildly, have some reticence towards the process or towards the fact that Ukraine and other countries should become EU member states. Then you have to do all the time advocacy visits, and this has to be done on both sides. I mean, not only as a government has to do this, but also think tanks and civil society at large. And one thing also I liked from what we heard in the Western Balkans is that you should ideally have two people. I mean, one in charge of domestic reforms, one in charge of the process, in the country, and one who is able to communicate all the time to keep everyone updated in all the EU capitals, in Brussels, and so on. I cannot skip the part about the change of methodology, because this is very important for us, I think. There is an emphasis in the new methodology on the so-called fundamentals, which is chapter 23 and 24. We've heard about this a lot in the Western Balkans. We see that is issue which is very charged in a way, is very political charge, including precisely for the reason that basically you cannot do progress in other chapters if you don't do progress in fundamentals. And I think this is the, I'm sure Milena could refer to this more, because that's what we heard also in Montenegro. And that, correct me if I'm wrong, but we had the feeling that in Montenegro, you have a lot of progress in many areas, but then some parts of the fundamentals don't go so well. And then you get stuck overall in the progress in your on your way. So I think we need to prepare very well from the very beginning on how do we deal with the fundamentals. I mean, as a government, but also what civil society, what could be the contribution of civil society in this respect. And also I think that the fundamentals and the overall reform of the methodology shows us that we need to think about how do we propose changes in the new methodology. I understand that when we discussed this with some EU counterparts, they said, well, this is fantasy, you won't be able to change the methodology. We still think we can change some things. We shall try at least. And I think here we shall have a united basically position together with all EU candidate countries in respect that we shall make the process more merit-based and less politically influenced. And when I say politically influenced, I precisely mean this possibility for one country to block the entire process. I think this is very unfair for the reforms, and this demotivates very much the reform process in the candidate countries. And I think for Ukraine, this would be a total disaster if this happens. We had the experience with the Dutch referendum, which was not about accession, what was about association agreement, but still it had a very big impact on us. And one more, just a few words about maybe a political consensus, because this is what, again, this is what it brought my attention a lot during preparing this the discussion paper. Basically, you cannot do real accession process if you don't have this consensus, if you don't have the backup from society and from the political forces, I mean, in the country. And therefore, one recommendation for the government, because Daria from the government is here, would be to try to keep as much as possible, I mean, the society on board of the process, because they are, I mean, the one who would basically support you on the way. And one thing to do this is also by including some civil society members in the negotiations working groups. Other thing is to communicate all the time. I know that Deputy Prime Minister does this quite often. I mean, it's communicating about, but at the beginning, it might be, how to say, easy to do this, but then when you have to do difficult things, and there will be a lot of things will be made in the name of the EU, sometimes not really in the name of the EU, but I mean, we have to make sure that this process remains inclusive, and we can keep on board the society. I mean, I might have skipped a lot of interesting things, but my time is out, so I'm sure Alena might add on from her side what hasn't been said. So Alena, over to you. I can't hear you, Alena. Does everyone hear Alena? No? We see you, but we don't hear you.
На жаль, не чутно Альони, можливо, поки налагодить технічні речі.
Unfortunately, we cannot hear Alona, so while she is addressing her technical issues, I can make a small intervention. Thank you very much, Leo, for this highly interesting analysis. I will overtake the moderation, and I would like to hand it over to Ms. Daria Gaidai. You have probably read the full text of the discussion paper, and based on that, what could you single out as the most useful recommendations? So please give us the evaluation of the status quo. Where are we now, and what can be done in accessing the European Union? Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you very much, first of all, for the work done. Thank you for having initiated the visit. Indeed, that's important right now to study the experience, to get prepared. And special thanks goes to you for this detailed and profound study we have made ourselves familiar with. This study includes the tips and the recommendations which are required to plan our further steps. And the paper also describes clearly the current architecture. On the next day, after Ukraine had acquired the candidate status, the discussion started on how to proceed, how to make progress, because of course the membership status, the candidate is not the end of the story, it's just the beginning. Now, when we discuss further actions with the European colleagues, they emphasize that it's not the enlargement process. There are some recommendations for enlargement process. The requirements are less stringent, typically, in this case. However, once Ukraine has got the candidate status, then it shall comply with more stringent requirements. And we make focus on this aspect during the talks, during the negotiations. On the one hand, this provokes some negative reaction because, of course, let's be sincere, not all these requirements are well defined and clear. They are stringent indeed, yet not well defined. The European Commission and the expert environment and government are absolutely sure that first of all, the requirements should be clarified. In this context, it's crucial to get the clear vision of what shall be done. As to the previous actions, I can say that the European integration reserve, a backup of lawyers and experts has already been developed. We are trying to engage young lawyers. We cooperate with certain civil society institutions to upgrade the skills of those who are engaged in the area of the European integration. We have also signed the memorandum with the Natolini College. At this college, the ministry employees can promote their skills. So it's important to do our best to improve people's qualification and to involve young people, young civil servants who make their first steps on their civil service journey. Because that's our backup, that's our resource towards the accession and during the accession talks. We witnessed the development of the questionnaire. I mean, the questionnaire Ukraine had to fill out before the candidate status. We got a unique experience, and actually we might have become a role model. The mobilization of all resources was unprecedented. Everyone who was willing to join got this opportunity. There were no demarcations, and by the way, it was a period of hostilities in Kiev region, and nonetheless, the work, the efforts were extremely intense. Everyone was filling out this questionnaire. We had a very serious support from the civil society. We know that not everyone is ready to join in. However, in some critical situations, it is possible to mobilize the resources. And now, when we have to fulfill the recommendations, experts join very actively the working groups. They participate in these working groups, in the monitoring groups. And due to these efforts, we can ensure quality, inclusiveness, and profound transformations envisaged by these recommendations. And all this is possible within a short period of time. Another important activity is studying the experience of other countries that have already finalized their journey. Now we are clear that the Ukrainian case and the Moldovan case will be unique. As far as I see, we will be progressing in parallel, I would say, to some extent. And now we've got the need to come up with the common position. This is one of the key work streams for us. We, as candidate countries, can exchange the experience right now, and we also can design our common approach on enlargement. Ukraine is not going to be a passive observer. Ukraine always has a very proactive standpoint. So we have to be proactive as well and make our contribution to this common vision. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Daria. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Sergei Solodky, for backing me up with moderation. Let me remind you that all our participants are currently in Ukraine. Therefore, we experience some issues with the connection. Please don't worry if someone abruptly drops out. But anyway, we're going to continue this discussion. Thank you very much. Let me emphasize that our studies are not conducted just for the sake of studies themselves. It's not analysis for analysis. We would like to produce something useful for Ukrainian decision makers. This particular analysis is intended for Ukrainian decision makers. This is the key target audience. Decision makers and those who will be actively involved in the accession talks. I think it's important to understand that. And I wish you lots of success in coming across people who would represent certain sectors, making their contributions to the accession talks. On the other hand, it's important to find people who have a good command of so-called Brussels language. As we discussed this issue with the previous negotiators, so negotiators of other countries, they focused on this importance of the Brussels language and the people who can use this Brussels language. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Mr. Leszek Yeshin, one of the negotiators. As far as I understand, he is on the road. He's traveling from Brussels to Warsaw at the moment. Mr. Leszek was advisor to the chief negotiator of Poland during the accession talks. And as far as I know, there were only two chief negotiators during the accession talks. And I think it's very important to know. It's important to achieve the sustainability, the stability of the process when the same people stay within the process for the entire time. Leszek, can you hear me now?
He disappeared. He was just on connected and then he got disconnected.
Ага, так, тому що він перебуває в дорозі, можливо, теж є проблеми з зв'язком.
Yes, because he is traveling now. Maybe not only Ukraine, but also Brussels experiences some issues with the connection. Okay, we should not wait for Mr. Leszek to reappear. I would like to hand it over to another speaker, Ms. Milena Muk, who represents a think tank from Montenegro, Alternative. Montenegro has been unique in terms of being involved in the negotiations for a decade so far, and this country was one of the first to participate in the new enlargement methodology. And prior to introduction of this methodology, the country managed to close 3 negotiation chapters. But after the new methodology had been introduced, the country got stuck, so to say. We were very pleased to cooperate, to communicate with Ms. Milena and her colleagues as we visited the Western Balkans, namely Podgorica, for both governmental and non-governmental experts from Ukraine and from Moldova. So during our visit in Podgorica, we were highly impressed by the engagement of this think tank in the negotiation process. So they are members to certain negotiation groups. We were really surprised by the structured and inclusive nature of the negotiation process in Montenegro. The representative of this center has become the Vice Prime Minister for European integration of Montenegro. Therefore, Ms. Milena, we are highly interested in your recommendations, which can be provided for Ukraine on the basis of your analytical centers, your think tanks experience. So please advise us on engagement of the experts from the think tanks, and also let us know what is a specific about the methodology. Is it relevant and should we keep it?
So thank you. And first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to provide inputs and recommendations, which I really hope can help you prepare for EU accession talks. And so I'm really extending my gratitude for being able to participate in this online discussion with you today. And I really hope that you are all staying safe back in Ukraine. So as you have said in the beginning, yes, Montenegro is in a way unique because of the inclusion of civil society into the working group since the very beginning of the EU accession talks. But if you ask me how it actually benefited the process, I think that we cannot give a straightforward answer. It mostly benefited the civil society organizations, that's definitely, because it managed also to build our own capacities and further engagement into the EU membership talks. But if we think about the government's perspective, I think that they mostly viewed this aspect as making some concessions to us and to civil society. They still did not actually saw us as an investment into the process, which I believe we can offer because of our experience in monitoring public policies and in providing policy advice. Also, what you should bear in mind if you include civil society in the working groups is also that it can also create additional high-level political bodies which might not be equally open to civil society organizations. And that happened in Montenegro at one point. For example, a rule of law council has been made, and it comprised only from these high-level political figures in our system, while not including civil society organizations. Later on, its structure was amended to also be open for CSOs. But in general, while we demand more openness and more inclusion, we should be careful that it can also create additional informal and closed venues for decision makers. So you should definitely bear this in mind. What I can also say from Montenegro's perspective is also that it is important not to sideline the parliament in the process. We all know that the EU membership talks suffer from this, what we call executive bias. They are namely conducted at the level of European Commission and national governments, but who actually holds the key to political progress and to the political will, which is essential for the progress in EU membership talks, is actually the parliament. So while not including the parliament in legislative activity enough, in alignment with the EU standards, and making them understand and internalize these EU values can actually also be very harmful for the process. Regarding the definition of benchmarks, which you rightfully noted as being a very important aspect of the EU membership talks, I can only underline that it is indeed very important to set as precise benchmarks as possible. And I will also add, not only it's not the precision, it's not only that matters, but also that you have as many track record benchmarks as possible, because what we had in Montenegro at one point, especially in the beginning, is the benchmarks were centered around adopting certain strategies, aligning laws with the EU standards, while the implementation was a bit out of sight, and we lacked tangible track record benchmarks, which will really prioritize, the achievements and results that we need in key priority areas. So really, once again, to underline that the benchmarks should capture the implementation of the laws, not these technical alignments. Also, in your paper, you have noted the phasing in or gradual integration as one of the key aspects of the new methodology. So when we talk about the new methodology, we should distinguish the new methodology which was applied to Montenegro since the beginning of the EU membership talks, which included front-loading of the rule of law reforms or fundamentals. But in 2020, we also had the new methodology, which will be fully applied only to North Macedonia and Albania, which actually, are starting their accession negotiations as the methodology was adopted. Montenegro could not fully implement, but it will implement some of the aspects of this new methodology. And one of those aspects is gradual integration, which you did note that Ukraine is already gradually integrating into some programs, especially in the energy area. Also regarding your remarks, what is there to negotiate about? I think the gradual integration is a venue to negotiate about. Because the new methodology, it just states the gradual integration as one of its aims, while not providing the clear roadmap is how this gradual integration will take place. So I think in this context of the vague methodology, all the aspiring countries should take a proactive role to develop their own roadmap of priority areas for gradual integration. So that would be my specific recommendation, not only for Ukraine, but also, of course, Moldova and other aspiring countries, because what you said, is there something to change about the new methodology? I wouldn't say that some drastical change is needed, but since it's a bit vague and it's not operationalized, I think that you can fine-tune some of these really positive aspects. And one of the most positive aspects is actually the gradual integration, because it will provide, I believe, and it is an opportunity to provide early benefits for the aspiring countries, not to wait for a full membership to tap this potential of specific EU programs, policies, etc. And finally, for this round, I would just also stress the importance of continuity and the institutional memory. And I would just definitely agree with the recommendations that you have made, that the leadership of the process should be in the hands of professionals, not political figures, because they might be much more easily replaceable, and they should be, if we are in line with the EU standards, much more easily replaceable than the senior managerial staff at professional positions in public administration. So I believe it's enough for this round, but of course I'm available for any further questions and comments.
Дякую дуже, пані Мілена.
Thank you, Milena. I understand that Leszek Yeshin joined us. Leszek, can you hear us? Leszek, can you hear us? Could you please confirm? Unmute yourself, please.
Yes, I can not
Супер,
only
супер,
hear but also speak.
супер. Дуже дякую, дуже
Perfect. Thank you very much
My pleasure.
for joining us. And thank you for your contribution to our discussion paper. I have two questions for you. My first question is the following. When we were preparing our discussion paper and we were learning the experience of other countries, we heard that one of the major challenges of Ukraine is the dimensions of Ukraine, its size, territorial size, because it's a too big country for EU integration seamlessly and painlessly. Poland is also a big country, and maybe you have some recipe or some recommendations how this downside or drawback, because it seems like drawback, I mean, the territorially big country, can be converted into advantage. So disadvantage converted into advantage. This is the first question. My other question for you is that recently, Ukraine has been learning experience of other countries and its accession process from the viewpoint how the negotiation structure should be built constitutionally, how it should be built. You had a bureau in the prime minister office, so you were directly reporting to prime minister. Ukraine has ideas. Maybe we should create the Ministry for European Affairs or some other types of ministries. However, we heard from talking to other people, our counterparts from other countries, they said that all ministries have to be European ministries, because if we only have one ministry for Euro integration, other ministries would say, listen, you've got the Ministry for European Affairs and they should be in charge of European integration. We are busy doing our other stuff, and especially during the war, all issues are pressing issues. So European integration is not on our agenda. So what would you recommend regarding the bureau or office or the structure that worked in Poland? And what recommendations would you give to Ukraine? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alona. First of all, I wish all the best to all of you in Ukraine, and keep my fingers crossed, and we do whatever we can to support you. That is also important in the sense of what we are talking about, which is the European prospects of the EU membership of Ukraine. First question is on the size of the country. The size matters, of course, but matters in a positive and negative sense, as always in life. And then I would start with disadvantage. Of course, you probably are you are familiar with the disadvantages, but the first and most important disadvantage that comes to mind is, to me, and it was also the case of Poland, is the ability, the necessity for the others to make a room for a big country in terms of money. So the share of common agricultural policy, financial wallet, and the structural funds and the cohesion policy is something that needs to be divided, and a big country is coming with a big needs. That is an obstacle that needs to be tackled in the bilateral relations with the countries mostly affected, but also the industries or businesses mostly affected, or sectors mostly affected. Which can be counterbalanced, and that is the way how to approach it, at least from my perspective, because the big country means big business and big market opportunities, and these two things need to be streamlined with those who might be having side thoughts or side wishes, and not that forthcoming for the membership of Ukraine. So I would argue, go for the big and use the advantage of being big by saying to the others, yes, hi guys, we are a big country, big agriculture, big opportunities, and let's make this place together. the reason why I'm saying is not only of the logic of the negotiating tactics as I'm phrasing this issue. The reason is also because the very bottom of the European integration is the markets. And the single internal market is the core and the very bottom of all whatever is happening in the European Union. Hence, enhancing or building or making it stronger is actually a huge contribution to the overall prospects of the European integration, as it is based on the markets. My second observation on that would be that you might use the size in a kind of soft way by contributing to all the problem solving in the European Union. This is a chattering class society in Europe, so they have to tackle the issue by negotiating, by discussing it. If you are at the side of the issue, if you do not engage with that, you do not contribute, in fact, to the problem solving. Even if you are outside, be in a sense proactive, and be proactive specifically in the areas that are problematic, or that there will be clearly important in the accession negotiations, like agriculture, like environment, like energy, like free movement of people, free movement of capital, all segments of free movement of goods, because these are also necessary to tackle. The last point is, do not neglect the fact that there are small players in the European Union, specifically the small countries, but also small businesses that might be hampering. So have eyes open on all of them and talk to the others, but specifically build the coalition with the big businesses and countries around the market opportunities. So that would be my answer to the size question. As to the constitutional or administrative structure, my observation is yes, I have described the Polish approach that as building an office within the Prime Minister's office, building a bureau within Prime Minister's office. And that was because of a specific construct, a specific composition of the Polish political and administrative and constitutional structure, where we have the Prime Minister, who is the strongest player of all. We do have the, I mean, structurally speaking, that changes from time to time. It changes from the coalition and the current setting of the political situation naturally. But constitutionally, we run a kind of semi-chancellorship structure in Poland. So that makes the Prime Minister as the strongest player for two senses, from two perspectives, which are of a key importance. First is of the ability to commit the country externally. So that constitutionally, the Prime Minister is able to say, yes, I say this, and this is going to commit the country, which is extremely important in terms of negotiations dynamics. So you need to make a phone call to the key, to the chief negotiator, and the chief negotiator reports immediately to the Prime Minister, and the answer is yes or no. And these are the kind of decisive moments in the accession talks. And there is a second extremely important reason why the Prime Minister in the Polish setting was important, is that he was able to be the deal breaker domestically. So he was able to domestically decide, yes, we are going to go along this perspective because I say it is the decision. Ultimately, there is a long process of negotiations taking into account the civil society and involvement of the civil society, involvement of businesses. But ultimately, there are some interests which clash and need to be solved in a purely political sense. And that is why it was the Prime Minister in our case, because he or she is able to do that constitutionally. Now, what's the specific structure for Ukraine? I would say it's in a sense up to the current constitutional and political field in Ukraine, provided that you take into account that it needs to be a person that is able to first do the deals or break deadlocks internally, and then provide a committing solution to the problems externally. So that would be my initial remarks.
Дуже дякую. Дуже дякуємо, пане Лешик. Все
Thank
зрозуміло.
you very much. It has been very interesting and very comprehensive.
Автор записки Леонід Літра, можливо,
I wanted Leonid Litra
на
to comment on some of the thoughts or maybe complement something.
I think the feedback we just got from the three speakers, which are not connected with the report we wrote, I think is somehow reinforcing certain of our arguments, but also points out where we shall pay more attention, because we are newcomers into this process to some extent. I mean, we had the association agreement, but still we are newcomers into the accession logic. And we might not feel all the time what should be a top priority among priorities. I mean, yes. And I liked the point about not trying to sideline the parliament. I think that's what we try to do actually in Ukraine, and the government has a memorandum, basically a convention with the parliament, in order to be clear that this year we adopt this 50 laws and this is a priority, and we have this asterisk, this which means a fast EU procedure, a fast procedure for the sake of EU accession and so on. I think this is precisely what we meant by having the consensus, the political consensus, trying to keep on board all the institutions, because the parliament is, of course, it's elected. They have the ultimate, in a way, power to decide, and they can say, you committed on this with Brussels, but we never said it's okay, and then the negotiations team, because this happened in some other instances, the negotiation team says, to the Brussels, you see, the parliament is against, so let's find another option. This happened with the visa liberalization, by the way, in Ukraine, when we received the action plan and the government was doing this and that, and the parliament saying, well, we never accepted this, So basically, I think this is a very valid point. And also, I wanted to underline from what I like from Polish experience is what has been mentioned is that the size could be also an advantage, but it's also a disadvantage. From the advantage part, I would say that also a lot of people in Ukraine, especially, the government, think that, because of the size, Ukraine would be actually more able to push for some decisions, would be more vocal, is more heavy, and we will have more kind of ability to maybe change certain things. I don't know to what extent this is true or not, because until you don't try, you can see it. But I know Ukraine is now trying to accelerate a little bit the negotiations, to accelerate the topic of opening the negotiations. We'll see whether it happens or not. So in this respect, I think this is also an important element to be highlighted. And one last point I wanted to mention is about the phasing in and about all the ideas with the accession to the single market. I think we already have this discussion for almost half a year, I think. And my personal conviction is that we need these milestones along the way, because as the experience show, the black and white approach is not really functional. You do a lot of efforts for 30 years and then you get the membership. This is not kind of the scenario we see I see as something plausible for for Ukraine. Therefore, I would say that we need to strive in when we open the negotiations, we already have a certain access to elements of single market in place. And with the war, the new elements were opened, like access to the labor market in the EU, like, basically taking out the quotas on products, on certain products and so on. So I think what we shall do is integrate into the single market, prioritize fundamentals and the cluster on internal market in Ukraine when negotiating with the EU, so we can on the way towards membership, we can benefit of certain elements of real, integration into the European Union, but also reinforce our own, motivation, like building the consensus and talking to the people that, European integration is something very practical. I think this is precisely where we can play with this and, keep the enthusiasm on the way. So that would be all from my side. Thank you, Alena.
Дякую, Леоніде. Дар'я.
Thank you, Leonid. Daria Gaiday, over to you now. Are you still with us? Yes, indeed. Perhaps you would like to provide your comments or to respond to some statements. Yes, sure. The enlargement process focuses largely on the fundamentals such as the rule of law, but of course we are also aware of the fact that everything started with the internal market, and economic interests are of high value within the EU. Ukraine is a large agricultural country, so it has its own interests which have to be protected, given also having in mind the processes of economic restoration and recovery. These should be clearly communicated to the partners. Other negotiations involve the discussion of certain preferences, while for Ukraine, the economic recovery and development will be the key topic. The European Union is currently one of the main donors of Ukrainians' resilience, Ukrainians' invincibility. And of course, the EU is interested in Ukraine's chances to develop and to recover. Therefore, we have to keep our trade preferences that have been introduced by the EU. We are extremely grateful for that. We have also to follow the way of the trade liberalization. At the same time, we should consider the interests of the groups within the EU, and we have to keep the dialogue with them in order to find the balance within the economic sphere. So Ukraine has to become the part of the European market while protecting Ukrainian sectors of economy such as agriculture, because it's about protecting the Ukrainian potential development. Thank you. Yes, our discussion paper also highlights one of the reasons why Ukraine's experience will be so unique. Namely, the reason is that Ukraine's accession will be running in parallel with Ukraine's recovery. So the recovery, renovation, restoration efforts will be performed during the membership period. And The Chancellor Scholz made also a statement that investing in Ukraine is investing in the same as investing in the EU. It's quite a progressive opinion. I believe that more and more European businesses and politicians should become aware of the fact that they are dealing currently with a future EU member. Maybe Ms. Milena or Mr. Leszek would like to recommend anything to add, any comments? If not, we can actually draw the line.
Yes, could you hear me?
Yes, we
Okay.
can hear you.
Because there was a side sentence in your question, I don't know, that I didn't really responded, which is about the internal administrative structure in our case, and that was very pertinent to the structure that you might wish to build. While being a bureau within the office of the Prime Minister, we did have a kind of matrix of communication with the line ministries. And this matrix of communication, in fact, resulted in building up of specific cells dedicated to the EU integration process within each and every ministry that was affected. Interestingly, over time, I mean, it's been well over 20 years passed since these cells first endured within the administration and then later dissolved because some of the ministries, line ministries, they were so become so actively involved in the daily business of the operation of the council, EU Council. I mean, that they didn't need any longer the specific dedicated units within their internal administrative structure. So what we had is it was a structure at the top that got communicated in a matrix way into the line ministries structure. We didn't have the, I mean, there was a period when we had the European Ministry or European Integration Ministry or an office, but this approach was abandoned over time. And then with this, later on was, at the time of membership already, it was reenacted, tried again, and then all the business went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But for the accession negotiations, again, this was from the top of the Prime Minister's office to the line ministries through the matrix structure.
Дуже дякую. Мілена, чи є бажання?
Thank you very much. Ms. Milena, would you like to make your contribution? Yes, I see your raised hand.
Yes, very briefly, because I think I didn't touch upon the Leo's question about the fundamentals and why Montenegro got stuck along the way. We are nominally the front runners, but the front runner who is lagging behind and who is already negotiating as twice as long as some of the countries that exceeded the EU in the previous period. And of course, the prevailing corruption and organized crime issues are the key factor. And there we really come to the point where it's very difficult to resolve those issues if you have penetration of organized crime into the official structures and you really have the prevailing corruption. So in a way, it's a puzzle which is very difficult to solve, but that's why we all need to map specific islands of excellence within the system and to try to work with them. But as I said, the puzzle is very difficult to solve if the elites are captured themselves and they are the ones who should conduct the reforms. That's why it is important, once again, to overcome this executive bias and to make the EU membership talks a societal issue where everybody will be involved. But also I would like to comment on Ukrainian anti-corruption policies, especially from 2014 onwards. From what we learned as civil society, we can even have some good practice examples from Ukraine in that regard. And I think that what I have also recently seen from your civil society and the coalitions that have already been established of civil society organizations to reconstruct and, I think it's Rise Ukraine and others who are already doing a lot to prioritize the reconstruction issues and to also make them more transparent and more responsive to citizens' needs. I think it's very commendable, and that's why I believe that you will have a good synergy between government and civil society along the way, because it's really crucial, especially with regard to these veto points and veto players that the very structure of the negotiations will have along the way, if you touch upon the vested interest of certain elites and certain actors who are not that willing to reform.
Дякую дуже, Мілена. Я думаю, що ми сьогодні обговорили.
Thank you very much, Milena. I think that today we managed to discuss lots of issues we highlighted in our discussion paper. We highly appreciate the contribution of our authors and the experts who we communicated with during developing this discussion paper. Today, it will be published in full on the New Europe website. Some parts of it have already been published on the website of the European Truth, Европейская Правда. Many of our Ukrainian experts, I'm sure, have already made themselves familiar with these parts. Many thanks also to the partners who assisted us in preparing this discussion paper and the study visit to the Western Balkans. This discussion paper was supported by the Renaissance Foundation and the financial support of the Swedish Embassy. Our special thanks goes to the Renaissance Foundation for the study visit to the Western Balkans, where we met Ms. Milena and many other politicians and experts. We will be doing our best in our New Europe Center to communicate as much as possible and to invest our joint efforts in the enlargement process. We've got lots to discuss with the other Western Balkans countries who are also accessing the EU now. Let me reiterate once again that we have to be not just proactive, but hyper proactive or even hyper creative, because nobody from Brussels or other EU members, maybe just from Vilnius or Warsaw, so nobody is going to speed up Ukraine's accession. It's for us to take care of this process, and we have to stick to recommendations, of course, which are in line with the key negotiation cluster, namely fundamentals. It's a kind of training for Ukraine on how it can comply with the recommendations. There will be lots of these criteria, lots of the benchmarks according to the new methodology. There are lots of baseline criteria, interim criteria, and final criteria for many chapters. We have to comply with the recommendations also on how to fulfill some vague criteria, because they vague criteria pose the barriers for us. More clear barriers, more clear criteria are easier to fulfill. In this respect, we have to cooperate with other countries that have participated or do participate in the negotiation process. We have to prove that democratic institutions are in place and the market economy is fully operational. To prove this fact, it may take a lot of time. For Ukraine, this does not mean procrastination. It's perhaps an opportunity to implement some important reforms. Of course, we know that some regress is also possible. We know that even after becoming the EU member, the country may demonstrate some regress in terms of reforms and positive transformations. Of course, there are still lots of topics to be discussed. And once again, I would like to emphasize another important topic for Ukraine. We do not have a representative of Northern Macedonia, but we have to mention the bilateralization concept. Any country, any EU member, can block the start of the negotiations or opening or closing this or that chapter. Ukraine is under this threat. We see it on the example of Hungary, and we will discuss further on how to avoid these risks enshrined in the new methodology. So maybe this new methodology should be somehow modified to avoid the unilateral blocking of the accession efforts, like it was in the case of Bulgaria and North Macedonia. We know that there are some countries that are skeptical to our accession. For instance, Germany is more skeptical as far as we see to Ukraine than to the Western Balkans. We also have to work with the countries such as France, Netherlands, and we also have to work with so-called silent members. Maybe they are supportive, however, they do not mention their position, they do not state their position clearly. So that's why we call them silent EU members, and somehow we have to transform, to convert them from silent to vocal and supportive of our accession. And finally, I would like to say the following. As said Ms. Vesna Pusic, the chief negotiator of Croatia, the accession process is positive in the meaning that it's the way to protect ourselves from ourselves, to protect ourselves from some things which we do in terms of regress in the rule of law and institutions. So that's the process to protect ourselves, to be on the safe side. EU accession is about Ukrainian development. Ukraine is now on the verge of survival. We need weapons, we need strict sanctions imposed on Russia. At the same time, we need some stimuli to develop, and this accession to the EU is regarded as the incentive for further development. So many thanks to all the participants, all the spectators. I think we still have some time before the talks are opened. Of course, we will do our best to shorten this period, and hopefully next time we will see the commencement of the negotiations. We are ambitious and realistic at the same time. Thank you very much, and see you next time. And let's hope